Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, budding lawyers. Wish you luck. I was probably practising law before most of you were born, except for the gentleman on the right there, of course. You've all been given by Ken Parrish the study guide to the Ombudsman, and may I say that it is an excellent summary of the legislation and what we do. And what I propose to do is to take you through it and point out some of the difficulties and exigencies that aren't apparent on just reading the Act. Start with the introduction. The first paragraph talks about the founding of the modern Ombudsman 200 years ago in Sweden in 1809. Now, the Swedes and the Danes think that the Ombudsman in the rest of the world is not a real Ombudsman, and they look down on us because they are an institution that is embedded in their constitution, whereas here we are not. And they say that deprives all Ombudsmen in the rest of the world of the appropriate degree of independence. In fact, in Sweden, the Ombudsman oversees judicial officers as well as administrative officers, which is slightly different than here because, of course, we have the separation of powers document, and the Ombudsman would never be given power to oversee judicial functions. I do like the quote at the bottom of the page. Democratic action is possible only through the instrumentality of bureaucratic organisations. Yet bureaucratic power, if it is not properly controlled, is itself destructive of democracy and its values. That is something always to be remembered, and it is very, very true, and it underlines the existence of the Ombudsman and its importance, particularly in a place like Northern Territory. I know we have interstate students listening, but in the Northern Territory we do not have an upper house. So the ability for matters to be debated and questioned is very high, because with 25 members in the lower house, everything is controlled by rather a small number of people. And the greater concentration you have of power in the hands of a few people, the more possibility there is that that power will not be abused, but it will not be subject to the usual sort of rigorous debate that you would get in other places. The Ombudsman role, I think, is pretty well set out in the study guides as a summary. And then we come to the heading, Toothless Tiger. Some people may think that this is an insult. I don't, because most of the Ombudsmen around Australia, and certainly overseas, they all have only powers to recommend. None of them have powers to make definitive decisions or orders that are binding on anybody. But nonetheless, their prestige and the power that they do exercise is extremely high, and it depends on the stature and the profile, usually, of the Ombudsman and the staff and how they do the work. The essential elements of being an Ombudsman are that you are independent, you are fair, and you are impartial. And you are free, it's very important too, as an alternate to going to a court. So the sanctions of public opinion are fairly strong. There's a big debate in the Ombudsman community about whether Ombudsmen should speak publicly to the media or whether they should confine themselves to simply publishing reports that are tabled in Parliament. When I came to this position 6 years ago, I took the traditional line and I never spoke to the media. In fact, I, when approached, would give them the spiel that I had been taught by my colleagues around Australia. But then I went to Canada, and in Canada the Ontario Ombudsman regularly speaks to the press, even before he's finished his investigation or report. He's very successful, he has a very high profile, he achieves great change, and more or less if he recommends something, it happens. So here in the Territory I found I was doing investigations into matters that I thought should be of public interest, should cause some response from the government, and they would be deemed as tabled in Parliament. Now, I don't know whether you've learned about parliamentary procedure, but when you have a sitting, at the end of the sitting, you'll get 10 or 20 reports like that. There'll be annual reports, coroner's reports, auditors' reports, and ombudsman's reports, if there are any. And they're all put in a bundle on the Speaker's table, and there's a little entry in Hansard, deemed to be tabled.
Preferably late at night when the journals are
Yes, that's right. And quite often it's done on the last day of the sittings at 10 to 5, with the rising due at 5. So I started speaking to the media when I published a report. And I must say the result, I think, has been favourable to the Territory, because issues get aired. Some of my reports have got a very bad reaction. Others have been accepted. I mean, I did a report once on what was happening to our patients in the Royal Darwin Hospital. And we have a very severe problem here with our Aboriginal people. They are subject to violence often, they have assaults, they get drunk, they hurt themselves. They go to hospital, and the moment they're patched up and they feel okay, they decide they want to leave. And when they leave, they often will not take their follow-up antibiotics. They'll rip off the plasters that should be there for months and things like that. And they end up coming back to the hospital some 2 or 3 weeks later, and at which time the treatment they need requires them to be 3 or 4 weeks in hospital, as opposed to if they'd done what they were told and stayed for, say, 4 days on the first occasion, it would be all right. Now, this has become a very severe problem for our hospitals, because 75% of the services in our hospitals are devoted to Aboriginal people. So to get around this, the hospital staff started calling the psychiatrist in to try and get them certified under the Mental Health and Related Services Act, so that they could be detained for 3 or 4 days under that Act. The psychiatrists didn't like this, so they refused to certify people if they didn't have a genuine mental illness. They would not subvert their powers for the sake of making someone have medical treatment. So the management issued a direction under the Medical Practice Act, which says that the general manager of a hospital is in charge of the premises. So they interpreted that to mean that the general manager of the hospital would issue a certificate saying that if someone's on the premises and the doctor wanted them to stay, they had to stay. In effect, it amounted to, in my opinion, deprivation of liberty and false imprisonment. Because people are entitled to refuse treatment no matter what the consequences if they have mental capacity. And these people did have mental capacity, there wasn't much doubt about it. But they just chose to leave. Some of them were kept there for months at a time. Some of them were even shackled and chained to their beds so they wouldn't leave. And when I did a report to expose this, it got a very nasty response. I think the Minister of Health said that this was saving lives, and if it was necessary, he'd change the law. In other words, he'd change the law to contradict the Declaration of Human Rights, which states quite clearly that no person, is to be restrained and deprived of their liberty unless it is according to law, which it wasn't. And then the doctors came out and said that the day that lawyers started telling doctors how to do their job would be the end of the world. So that got a very bad reaction. But you learn to live with that. So the sanction of public opinion, and in particular the media, is actually terribly important. And it does achieve change. Even if it doesn't achieve change, it inspires debate. And that is very healthy and a good contribution to democracy. So I don't mind being called a toothless tiger. That means I don't have to wear a muzzle when I go out in public. Now, you've been told about the case of Mr. Cotton. I think when we deal with the media and them retracting things, you have a particular problem. So I'm not going to take it any further than asking you to read that case and understand how an injustice can occur and how there can be little remedy if you don't have the Ombudsman intervening. I mean, this man probably couldn't afford to take this matter all the way to the High Court on his own. He did get some redress, not perfect, but he did get some redress. And he got publicity, and the principles are here, and years later you are studying and learning from it. Now, to me, that's a good outcome from an Ombudsman's exercise of powers. Right, now I have to correct Ken here when we come to jurisdiction. The Australian Bankers Association Ombudsman and the Life Insurance Ombudsman have been abolished, and they now... Yeah, you better update that bit. They're now the Financial Services Ombudsman, and they still do the same functions, of course. Now, there's a big difference between a parliamentary ombudsman and these, what they called industry ombudsmen. In fact, there's a big debate about use of the word ombudsman even. as I said, the essence of an ombudsman is they are independent, impartial and objective. Now these industry ombudsmen are in fact a contractual arrangement between people in industry or commerce who have set up an ombudsman themselves, and they pay for that ombudsman's office as a way of retaining self-regulation of their own industry. And let's take telephone carriers for instance. The Telecommunications Ombudsman receives something like 300,000 complaints a year about mobile phones, telephone services. Each carrier, as a condition of getting their telecommunications licence to carry on business, has to agree that they will have an effective independent complaint system for customers. Now they could all set up their own, it will be part of their internal structure, it would not have the appropriate independence. So what they've done is they have combined to set up the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman, who is actually an independent person who answers to a board. The people on that board are the captains of industry in the telecommunications business. And it's not in theory truly independent. However, I can tell you in my experience of dealing with Telecommunications Ombudsman and going to their meetings over the last 5 or 6 years, the woman in charge of it is absolutely ferocious. I mean, I can't imagine any board daring to sack her. And the whole organisation has done such a good job and is held so highly regarded by people who use that service that it is de facto achieving a very, very good purpose. I must say I had occasion to use it myself once, and I was very humbled about what we lack here in the Ombudsman's office in the Northern Territory. And the same applies to insurance, superannuation, which are now part of the Banking Services Ombudsman. There's a big debate about who should use the word ombudsman, and it is becoming, in some people's eyes, quite a devalued term. For instance, you may have heard of the Fair Work Ombudsman here in the Territory. Now, that ombudsman actually is a regulator, and what it does is it inspects books and hears complaints about payment of wages and other conditions, and has the power to order an employee to make up back wages or to give someone penalties or extra holiday pay or whatever. And it is not an ombudsman in the traditional sense. It is a regulator, and there is a big difference as far as the rest of the ombudsmen are concerned. And in New South Wales, most shire councils have a council ombudsman. Now, basically that's a complaints manager and not an ombudsman, because it's an employee of the council. And independence is totally lacking, because if it starts telling council residents that it doesn't like what the mayor or the council has decided, you can bet they'll be shifted sideways, if not sacked. So they're not truly ombudsmen because they don't have that independence.
Can I again very deeply thank the Ombudsman for her time. It's been one of the most fascinating talks, I have to say, that I've heard here in my far too long at Charles Darwin University. So thank you again. We hope you will come again, and we'll take it from there. Thank you. Can I say goodbye to Grace Hooper out there in Arnhem? I'd like to know whether it's too windy for me to go to Garma. Come on, Grace. I know she's possibly. Possibly. Thank you, Grace. Okay.